Hello, everybody. Have you heard of the school to prison pipeline? That Black kids receive harsher discipline in schools than white kids, are more likely to be suspended, and more likely to end up in prison as a result. Our guest today offers a unique lens on this from inside the classroom. Dave DeJohn is a high school teacher and a doctoral student in educational leadership at the University of Houston. He wants us to understand what happens inside the classroom that results in such heartbreaking outcomes and what can be done about it. His personal journey will give us insights as well. Hello, everybody. I am totally delighted to bring to you Dave DeJohn. Now, Dave and I have an interesting history. He approached me to serve on his dissertation committee, and we met briefly so he could introduce himself. He was with his lovely wife, whom you're going to meet sometime during this hour. And we ended up talking for about 2 hours for what was, I had planned a half-hour interview. That's because Dave proved to be a very fascinating person. So I want y'all to imagine this guy, a white man who has a passion for African American children and ensuring that they can be the best they can be and that their education that they get is the best it can be. Not only does he believe that and that that's what he's about and why I invited him here, but he's also doing research on it. He's a phenomenal background in what it takes for, what shall I say, African American kids, I'll just say that, children of color, to get to be educated in today's climate. So that's what I invited him for, and that's why he's here. So let me tell you a little bit about his background. Okay, on LinkedIn, he says, and y'all, I love this. Get ready. Creative problem solver, change agent, emotional storytelling by media, big ideas, proven results, champion of social justice and student outcomes. Right now, he's a high school teacher, an audio video, which is his passion, and a dual credit teacher. The students that he teaches are in Houston's third ward, which is a predominantly Black community. He's at Jack Yates High School, and I know some of the Jack Yates kids are screaming, alumni are screaming right now, just at the very thought that one of their own is here. And he's managed somehow for the kids to get dual credit in community college. So when they graduate high school, those who are in his class will have credits towards community college degree. He's won big awards, and I'll just mention two. Oh, I gotta say this. His students achieved a finalist status, his media students, at a statewide film festival. I'm gonna put all of this in the notes below so you can get the details. He
By the way,
won.
I was going to say that we recently won. I haven't updated my LinkedIn. Thanks for reminding me. We won first place in state last month at the UIL Film Festival.
All right. Okay. He won Newcomer of the Year award at Jack Yates High School. He won at Lone Star Community College. He won Adjunct Excellence Award. So, so this is a heavy duty person who has a lot to say and who has a magic, and this is what I'm hoping we'll be able to tap, tap, a magic technique for reaching kids, young adults, shall I say, that some people think aren't reachable. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you, ma'am. It's an honor to be here. I'm so humbled by what you just said.
Wonderful. Okay, so let's get started. I said all of this, and obviously, who you are and how you came to be is fascinating to me. So let's begin there.
Okay.
You know that we in Leading Consciously focus on racial and social justice, and specifically on leadership in racial and social justice. Sometimes I say leadership in multicultural organizations, but for me, that's the same thing because you can't lead in multicultural organization without a racial and social justice focus. So that's what we're about. How in the world, what's your background? How in the world did you get into this?
Well, thank you. So I think where I'd like to start is I was actually born in 1964, the year that civil rights laws were passed, and I was in a very white community in Houston called West University, and I actually started school in 1970 when the same year that HISD finally implemented the Brown versus Board education desegregation. It took them 15, 16 years to do this. So that was the year that I started. So in my elementary years, all white. In middle school, junior high, there was a mix of African American and white, but it was very segregated, lunchrooms, sports, those kinds of things. And I was in the marching band, which was predominantly white. But when I went to high school, at Lamar High School, most of the band was black, but all of the drummers were black. Now, there were a couple of white drummers that started with me, but they didn't want to learn how to dance. They didn't want to learn how to moonwalk. I struggled with it. But what I started finding was my new friends would take me to Third Ward, Sunnyside, African-American neighborhoods. And I would tell young people, this is before Eminem and all these cool white guys were around. And so at the time, my mother worked at nights. My stepfather had an air conditioning business. So I was kind of a latchkey kid. So I would hang out in Third Ward, and the mothers in Third Ward, Sunnyside, they thought I was too skinny. They would feed me, but there was also structure. I had to help wash dishes. I had to help, with carry laundry and those kinds of things. And there was some tough love every now and then because I smoked cigarettes back then as a young man, and I would get lectured. And so there was this love that was there. And I joined a group called Marching Thunder, which was run by Calvin Murphy, the former Houston Rockets legend, the baton twirling corps. Yeah. So I was a drummer there, right a block away from Yates High School. So that's how I met the band director at Yates. And she would always say, she called me Black Boy. She would say,
she called you Black Boy?
I had a shirt. In fact, it's in storage somewhere that said Black Boy on the back. She says, you need to come to Yates. And so in my senior year, I had some life moments in my senior year where I actually got to leave Lamar and I got to attend Yates High School. The year that Yates went to the football state championship in the Astrodome. So of course, when the cameras would come to Yates, here's this white guy trying to dance. And I started getting a lot of attention. And so that was sort of how I grew up. And at Yates, I met a young lady, and we began a family very early. And my family was not happy about that. So I ended up moving out of Houston.
Hang on, back up.
Okay.
Let's back up. You met a young lady. What's her ethnicity?
She's African American.
Okay.
And what's interesting is the first question that my stepfather asked me when I said I got a girl pregnant was, is she Black? And I said, yes. And he said, how dark is she? That was one of the first questions. And she's very dark, my first wife. And so my family was really upset. So my father, who lived in Georgetown, Texas, which at the time was a very small city, I moved there, and that's where I finished school. And that was an all-white, it was just an all-white school. I mean, the prom was in a barn. They played two kinds of music, country and Western. So that was my senior year. I went from a mixed school to an all-black school to an all-white school. And then I joined the military and married her, and married her, and we ended up having 5 children.
5 children?
Yes, ma'am.
Altogether, including the first.
Including the first, who scary is turning 40 this year.
Whoa. Okay. Okay. Now let's go back to your stepfather. I just want to clarify. He was not happy because she was pregnant, because she was Black, or both.
It was all of the above, but the issue was more about her race than it was her being pregnant.
Okay.
Without a doubt, it was more
Okay.
about race.
So you have this wife, you're in the military, you've had all of this back and forth, all white, mostly Black, all white exposure. You
Right.
went to the military.
Well, I mean, let me just back up for 1 second. Later on, I realized that getting her pregnant made me fully committed to the African American world. Before, I could have very easily just gone off and gone back to the white side and cared about Black people. But now I was living in Black neighborhoods, going to family reunions where I was the only white guy there, and there was definitely a connection. I was linked by blood with my children and my family. And although I still love my white family, and I'll tell you, my children are the best looking children in all of my white family. talk
I-
about talk about continuous improvement. But but again, there are a lot of white people who will say I love Black people, but they've never been to a Black church, and they get uncomfortable in a Black neighborhood, and that's something I don't do. What I did not realize, though, was that when my children started having trouble in school, it was my white privilege who enabled me to negotiate with the leadership there. My ex-wife could not, like, she would get frustrated and say they're racist. And I would go up there and think that I had good sales skills, but in reality, I didn't realize that my white privilege was an advantage.
right. And so they paid attention to you.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay,
did.
so I want to ask you something.
Okay.
Here you are with this Black family in
Mhm.
these Black neighborhoods. How did it feel to be the only white person? Did it feel lonely, scary, fun, uh, self-conscious? Just describe the inner state you had.
That's kind of a tough one because I think the uncomfortable parts happened when I was younger. Um, there were times when I would, like, say, be at a church where I didn't know anybody and I was the only white person, and things were done that were a little different because I grew up in an all white church where only the deacon could say amen very quietly. So I'm in an African American church. We're not sitting down. So there were times when I would sit in an African American church, and because I had grown up in a white church where everything was just quiet. And in fact, I remember saying that my grandmother would nudge my grandfather when he would start snoring because it was kind of quiet, and you'd be able to hear that little faint snore. In an African American church, it was just completely different. And so over time, though, my comfort now when I'm around African Americans, there's a comfort that I don't have when I'm around whites. I'm suspicious. So I don't know when that shifted, but like, if you could see me at school, there's very few white people that come to Yates. I think there's 5 white teachers total, and I think 2 or 3 white students, and so my comfort is around African Americans more so than anything else, and I don't know when that shifted.
Well, that's fascinating. So it did shift though. And the fact that you're more comfortable about around African Americans, is that is that a neutral feeling for you that you are? Are you glad? Is that something that's disturbing? How do you feel about that?
I've never been asked that before.
Proud, sad, puzzled?
It's I mean it's
It is as it is.
they're my people, right?
Yeah.
They're my people, and um I remember I was in a social activist group here in Houston where we were doing this white privilege exercise, and because of the way I had to score it, I was way on the white side. And all of my black friends were saying, "Hey, Dave, you should be over here with us." Right. And I felt hurt that I wasn't over there by them. And then one of the white people who definitely love black people made the comment, I think I want to start going to a black church because I think y'all have more fun there. And including me, every black person was just offended and said, "So you think that that's what we do? You think that when we're worshiping, we're having fun?" And it turned into this, and I was angry too. Right. And so, but at the same time, the guy didn't know. I mean, he wasn't trying to be mean. But a lot of other white people, when he said that, kind of chimed in. And of course, at the same time, I didn't go berate him or anything. It was, I mean, because my black family, they took care of that. they took care of him. But again, it's, you know, there are people that try. I mean, even in the old 1970s show, All in the Family, you know, Archie Bunker was racist as they came. And when he would try to do nice things for black people, he would do something like he told a lady, I remember this, he was going to have a housekeeper come in. She's African American. And he told her that he would get her watermelon if that's what she wanted. And he didn't think he was being racist. And I think modern day that still happens, that white people, they try to say something nice. They try to fit in, and they say something that's hurtful. And in many cases, especially depending on the situation, there's really no response. And so anyway, that was just sort of, I guess I kind of started seeing that in education as well. You know, that a white teacher may say something that's offensive. And of course, the student's not going to say anything back if it's a predominantly white environment. So anyway, that's just sort of some recent memories I have.
Okay. So basically what I'm gathering, and I'm putting it together, it answered my question, how did you feel about it? What I'm gathering is just is, and that's where your home base is. Your home
Sure.
base is with African American community.
I mean, we have lived in all different communities, my wife and I. And right now I live in Third Ward in a historically African American neighborhood, which is becoming gentrified. And what my students think is funny, because some of them actually see me, like I'll get a message through the Teams app that'll say, "Hey, Mr. D, I saw you trying to run around the bayou," right? And because I was trying. But they think it's funny that most of the whites that live in this neighborhood, they'll walk the neighborhood when it's sunny. And when the sun goes down, they don't. But when the sun goes down, I mean, I'm getting older and I teach in school, so I go to bed early. But there's this is a very popular place for white people to move to because it's inner city and the property values are really high. But when Mignon and my wife and I drive through the neighborhood, I tell her all the time, "Gosh, I feel so at home here, no matter where we go." The students refer to an area of the bottom. They call it the bottom,
Yeah.
where there's some kind of rough things that are going on, and there's just no fear. This is where we belong. Where I get worried is when we go over to where I grew up and I see a police officer. And Mignon drives a lot because when we were in the Middle East, I drove because that's kind of expected.
Mignon is your
there.
wife. Let's clarify.
Mignon is my wife. So there, they would tell Americans that if a female is driving and gets pulled over, the police could, manhandle her. So the men should drive. So I drove for 3.5 years. So now Mignon drives us everywhere. But when we're driving on the white side of town, I probably get more nervous there than I do here.
Because you're with in an interracial marriage.
Right.
And protective of her.
Yeah. And I'm sure that we could handle whatever would happen, but still I feel much more comfort here, whether it's going to a restaurant, going to the store, going wherever. I just feel more comfortable here.
When I lived in New York in the 70s, and it just occurred to me part of why I have gravitated to you like I have. we belonged to a black group, a black power group. And there was a white guy there who was married to a black woman, and they had 3 or 4 kids. And there's something about you that reminds me of him. There's a critical difference was he just gave up on being white. He told everybody he was black, and he'd fight them about it. So we knew he was white, but you want to be black, that's fine with us. We don't care. Which is, of course, different from now when somebody, Ruth Donzel or whatever her name is, claimed to be black. People trashed her. And as I grew up, if you're white and you want to join us, you're welcome. And there was no issue, come be a part. So what you're describing is that. It's interesting to me that nobody's condemning you. You don't seem to be getting condemning. Nobody's calling you names. If none of that's happening.
Not to my face. I mean, now you bring up something really interesting because I'll tell you what a student told me recently, or I guess it was before Christmas. I talked to a student's mother because I was trying to get him into the dual credit program, and we had a great talk. And when he came in the next day, he said, "Hey, my mom said that you called. She said, I talked to your white teacher." And he said, "Who?" He said, "Mr. Dejan." And he goes, "I told my mom that N-word is black." That's what he told. And I said, "You told your mom that?" And he said, "Yeah." And so when there's this badge of honor, I guess, that, wow, but what's interesting to me is, we talk about how race is a man-made thing. And what we're really talking about is what's going on the inside, even though we define someone by what's on the outside. So when you talk about your friend that you had, there were times when I would say that I'm black, especially when I was younger. But now I recognize that, in this country, I can't be. And in some cases, Mignon's going to kill me for saying this, but Mignon has taken me to do negotiations on houses because she knew that they were going to accept me, even though I know nothing about finance. I know nothing about down payments. I'm a creative guy, right? But she would take me and she'd more or less say, "Stand here." Okay. And then she would negotiate and we would get the house. And she would say, because she wanted to take advantage of my white privilege. So I do
use the resources you have available to you.
Yes, ma'am. But then recently we went, when we took the kids to Austin, Texas, it was really cold that day. And we stopped at Buc-ee's because one of our sponsors that was with us had a credit card. So she said, "I need to go in and see if we can use the credit card so the kids can all get food." And so when she went in there, I thought, let me go in there because, we are at Buc-ee's. And so I went in and she was showing the lady, and I came up and I put my arm around her and I said, "Everything going okay, sis?" And the lady looked at me and she goes, "Yeah, I think the card is fine." So, use it where I can. And when we walked outside, I said, "Sister, I'll use my white privilege. It's going to help our kids." And she just thought that was so funny. So anyway, that's, like you said, use it where I can. And interestingly, I know we'll talk later about my research, but that's where I hope I'm going to have impact as a white man with other white people.
Okay, so just take me there. Take and do this rather quickly because I do want to spend more time on your research.
Okay.
Take me through why you chose the educational field, why you chose media, and then why you chose Yates.
Okay, so the media part is probably first. I when I was younger and I had hair, I looked like I was 16 when I was 26. And I was a consultant. I would go into companies and I would advise them on safety. And a lot of people didn't listen to me. And we had this video camera at the company that nobody was using. So I started making these little training videos, and all of a sudden they were taking off. And then I worked at Pepsi Cola. I made my first music video. It was about reducing accidents, but it was, I played drums in an African-American church in San Diego. And my band members helped me make this video, and it just took off throughout the country. This is before things could go viral. There's no internet. And I realized that I'm probably better at making films and people listening to them than listening to me. And so over time, I commercials. Mostly, it was mostly industrial training, but, trying to take something that's inherently boring to workers, especially, and then engaging them with video was sort of what my forte was. And then someone convinced me to hey, you should make your own movie. I was at a training, you should make your own movie. So I made a movie that was sort of based on how I felt my family had turned on me when I was younger. And it was a pretty, downer. It had a real down ending. And then unfortunately at the end of that, after being married for 18 years, we went through a divorce. A lot of it had to do with that film. So I went to the therapist, and the therapist said, "Can you write a story that's like happy?" And so guess what the happy story was? When I became the first white drummer at Yates High School. So I wrote a script called Beat of a Different Drum, and I started looking for classmates. And back then we had a website called classmates.com. There was no Facebook or anything.
Right.
And when I looked at Yates High School and Lamar High School, I saw Mignon, Yvonne Guidry. And all the drummers were in love with her. The drummers would say, "We don't know what race she is, but she's so pretty." And so they'd say, "Hey, Mignon, watch this white boy moonwalk." And I'd try to moonwalk, and I wasn't very good. And she'd laugh. So I would say, "Do you remember me?" And eventually she didn't write back at first. And finally she wrote back and said, who would forget you? You're that white guy that thought you were cool and, blonde hair, dancing around, whatever. So eventually I came to Houston and we got married, and both of her parents were teachers. And she very early on said, "You should be a teacher." I'm like, "Are you crazy? You know how much trouble I got in school? I'd never be a good teacher." And then my band director from Lamar, Anthony Maxey, was retiring. And so Channel 2 wanted to do a story on him, but they were focusing on this elementary school where he was a teacher. So because I had done all this, finding all these people, we did a video on him and how he changed our lives. And in that video, I didn't realize how much impact he had on everybody. I thought it was just me. So it wasn't long after that, I was getting involved in my kids' school here. And I said, "Hey, I'm a video producer. I could talk to your kids about video." But instead, the counselor's like, "Can you do a video for us? And where we don't have to pay you." And so we did an orientation video with the kids, and oh, it was so awesome. And this lady approached me and said, "You were really awesome with kids, and the video y'all did was really good. You should think about teaching." Now, at first I said, "Not in a million years," right? But that seed that Mignon planted, and I think thinking of Mr. Maxey, was like, "Okay, I'll give this a shot." Now, when I decided that I wanted to teach, at first I wanted to go back to Yates, because Yates has always had a communications program that had originally television production. Even when I was there, even though I didn't really get involved in it, there was a television production group there, but there was no availability. So the first year I taught in an all-white school. And I tell you right now, after all this research, I was very colorblind back then. Even though everything that I had gone through, there was like, everyone has the same opportunity. Everyone's going to be treated the same. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, college, all that stuff. And it was awesome. I was teacher of the year that first year, but then a student passed away my first year, and I took it really hard. And so I quit. I said, "Okay, this was too much emotion for one year." Also that year, my stepfather had passed, and my grandson had passed away at 22 days old. So that first year was too much for me. But then out of nowhere, I get a call from Galena Park ISD, and they asked me to come show some films up the game. I think I want to work with marginalized populations. And they're like, "Oh, all of our students are Hispanic. You should come here." So I went there, and I didn't know they were going to have kids there. And I showed them all these films that my students had done. And they're like, "Oh, mister, you should teach here." And I'm like, I called Mignon, "Okay, I'm just going to do this one more time." And so I'd never taught all Hispanic students. And it was very different. I mean, it was almost like being in the white environment. It was like, "Look at me, Mr. D, look at me." And the parents, the helicopter parents, all over the place. And at this school, the students were kind of quiet and not trusting and those kinds of things. But long story short, we went to the South by Southwest Film Festival. We were finalists. We were finalists at the white school as well, but we were finalists at Galena Park, and we won runner-up, like in the whole state. And it was a film that was shot right in the Galena Park neighborhood, and the kids just did such a phenomenal job. But after that, I decided that I wanted to get my master's degree and move up in education. So that's why we went to the Middle East. And you talk about a culture shock, culture shift. I'll tell you right now, when I left there, I was worried about terrorism and all that other stuff, because we were 10 years after 9/11. Of course, when I got there, I felt safer there than I've ever felt in the United States. When I went to the Middle East, it was an opportunity where I could make a lot of money and pay for my master's degree. But initially there was a fear, that 10 years before that was 9/11, terrorism, all those other things. And my family would say, be careful over there. What I should have been saying is, no, you be careful in the United States, because there's just no crime. There's either expats there that don't want to get kicked out of the country, and then everyone else there is making pretty good money. So I also learned that Islam is more closely related to Christianity than any Christian here would want to believe. And when we would go through Ramadan, we would fast, and we started experiencing some of the same physical things that they experience when they're fasting. And but what my Kuwaiti boss there told me, he thought the reason why we had become successful, number one, because Mignon was running things for our team. And I was over all these PhD consultants.
Okay. I want to stop you
Okay.
here, because you have now described teaching 4 groups of kids, 4 cultures: white culture, Black culture, Hispanic culture, Muslim culture.
Right.
Compare and contrast.
Oh, wow. Okay. So the white students, I would say, were very, very in my face, very look at me. I want to be the best. And parents, I mean, I had parents that would come up and say, would you like a booster club? And I'm like, sure. And all of a sudden after school, 5 ladies would come in and they'd say, okay, you can't really be involved in this. We're going to do bylaws and all this other stuff. And I'm just clueless. And all of a sudden we have a booster club and we're bringing in money, right? For field trips and all that other stuff. At Galena Park, the Hispanic culture, there were more white teachers at the school than anything else. And there was this belief that the families didn't care. So we would have open house, families wouldn't come. But what I found interesting was when I did have a reach out to Hispanic, in a lot of cases, because we worked after school and we'd film on the weekends, I'd have to talk with parents. They cared more about their kids than the white school. I mean, there were family things. I'd get invited to quinceañeras and weddings and all this other stuff. But that's when I started learning that it wasn't so much that like the other assumption I heard was that they're worried about INS, or they're worried about, something like that. But in reality, and it wasn't even that they were working multiple jobs. In some cases that was true. It was they didn't feel comfortable coming up there.
Yes, that's what the research says.
Right.
And teachers push them away without knowing it.
But isn't it fascinating that when we went to South by Southwest, we were taking 30 kids. The principal, who was a Hispanic guy, said, if the parents won't come up here, then the kids can't go, whichever parent doesn't come. So I had a couple of parents that I was really close to, and one of them actually worked at the school. She got everything together. I said, let's do the United Nations thing. I'll talk and then you explain. Every single parent showed up. Every parent showed up and they were excited. And when we came back, when we had won, we had a whole group, kind of unorganized, whole group of parents excited and cheering and whatever else. But that was really the awakening for me, that every parent cares about their child. This whole idea that but this parent comes to everything and they pay money and they do this and that doesn't mean that those parents love their kids more. But it was from there that we went to the Middle East, to Kuwait, and we were supposed to be.
Which wife is this? Mignon or
Mignon.
Okay.
Yeah, so I didn't start teaching until I was married to Mignon, and we had been married for maybe 6 or 7 years, and she had sort of been grooming me all those years. Not that she was trying to get me to apply to be a teacher. She just kept saying, you're so good with young people and you just explain things in ways where my father used to, because her father was a master educator. And both of them worked in HISD, and they were both African American teachers who taught in Black schools. And then when the whole desegregation thing happened, both of them were shipped to the white neighborhoods, to the white schools. And so anyway, so when we went to Kuwait, the idea was the rich Kuwaitis were working in the air conditioned control rooms, and it gets to be 120, 130 degrees out in the field. And workers from different nations would come, in some cases, not understanding safety standards, and they could turn the wrong valve and blow the whole facility up. So what was supposed to happen was the Kuwaitis were supposed to go out and watch them and then give them feedback. And if something was wrong, they needed to find out why and enter it into the system, and they just wouldn't do it. So I was able to work with Kuwaitis and become really good friends with them, and they would demonstrate it. And because I had my camera there, because I was getting my master's, it was a hybrid class in Los Angeles. So I had my camera there. So we would film that. And what we started finding was when we would show those films, they would say, everyone knew everybody. So no matter where in Kuwait, they'd say, oh, that's Muhammad. And they would show Muhammad very upset in the film, and they'd say, you know why he's angry? He has 2 wives, right? And it became this sort of, they felt like they were in Hollywood or something. And so when the contract manager, who's Kuwaiti, said the reason why the Americans that have been on this contract couldn't understand is they were trying so hard to get the Kuwaitis to think like them, and they didn't stop for 2 seconds to think like the Kuwaitis. And he said, you and your wife have penetrated the culture. I'm going, oh, that's interesting. And one of the managers came to me and said, I got my engineering degree at MIT, and I can design any piping system in Kuwait, but you have a harder job. You got to change Kuwaitis, right? You got to change Kuwaiti behavior. What was happening was, the attire that Kuwaitis wear, especially in the evening, the men, they wear the dishdasha and the gutra. And sometimes Americans would come over and they'd buy the cheap ones at the grocery store, and then they take their selfies and put it on Facebook. But in my case, the Kuwaitis would take me to their tailors, and in many cases they would pay for this, and it wasn't cheap, but they would. So I would have this attire, and I'll send you a picture of me there in the attire. And they had these sessions called Duania, where in the evening you would go and the men would sit and they would just socialize. And again, I just felt so at home, and we would, not everybody spoke English, but they would teach me Arabic words, and it was beautiful. What else? The other thing,
Dave,
yeah.
hang on. You are doing something so that the Hispanic teachers like you, the Kuwaitis like you, the African American like you. You are penetrating these cultures everywhere you go. Can you say what it is that you're doing?
I guess my perspective would be that I accept that my culture, my upbringing, my whiteness is not in charge, if that makes sense. I can look at another culture and recognize the strengths of the culture and recognize, think about this. We were in Kuwait where Kuwaitis were in charge. Like Kuwaitis had rights, and it was even in their laws that Kuwaitis have rights and people who are not here don't have the same rights. And so, but yet they would, and I think part of their frustration is that Americans know everything, and they're know-it-alls, and they don't even try to understand our culture, and they may even ridicule some of the things. I remember one Kuwaiti operator who said, I know that Americans criticize us because our women cover, but he said, do you have daughters? And I said, yeah. And he goes, how do you feel when a man looks at your daughter in that way? Now, every father out there who has daughters knows what that means. You're at the mall, some guy's looking your daughter up and down, you want to go fight. So he said, years ago, our women started covering so that other tribes wouldn't steal the women. And even to this day, you can't look at my daughter and look at her that way because she's covered when she's in public. Now, that doesn't mean I have to agree with him, but I certainly respect that culture and what that decision is for that culture. And for me to walk over there and say, oh, you know what, your daughter doesn't have rights, that's to me, that's that know-it-all kind of thinking. And I've even, as a teacher at Yates, I've had people who have said, all you really need to do is teach the students about the value of money, or they say something that's just such this simple solution without even trying to understand that when you have a student who is in a family who maybe is going through, like during the pandemic, I would ask students to turn their microphone on during virtual sessions, and they didn't want to do it. And when they finally did, there was so much noise in the background. And then I would find out that here, this high school student is taking care of 4 of their siblings because their parents are working, and they're trying to get their brothers and sisters to do their assignments on their computers. And now we're expecting this student to just make A's and do their homework and turn in their assignments, and not even stopping to see where someone else is coming from, or I guess the definition of empathy. I mean, there's no chance to get other cultures or other people to even think about what it is that I think is important.
Okay, so let's take this theme of empathy.
Okay.
Is Mignon there?
Yes.
Ask her, is there a way for us to see both of them, or turn the camera to her?
Sure. Yeah, she'll come on over. And tomorrow is our 20-year anniversary.
Hello, lady.
Hi, Dr. Ladding.
Let's see here. There you go.
Hi there.
Hi there. Okay, I just asked Dave a question, and I want to hear your answer to that question. Apparently, the two of you, him for sure, because he's been in 4 cultures he named. I don't know how many of those cultures you went with him. What is it that Dave, and probably you have, that he's able to win over people in such different cultures?
And it's kind of hard to put it into words, but I think it's a genuine authenticity in trying to understand someone else's situation first. It's not about him and what he wants to say, what he thinks they should say or do. There's a thing when he meets new people that he says all the time, so what's your story? And in asking that question, he immediately is learning something about that person and what their story is. And when he's in the classroom, he's the same way with students. He doesn't, he knows being in the classroom isn't just about everybody shut up and listen. Here's the lesson, this is all we're going to do today, and you can't be disruptive or have any of your own issues. He takes the time to understand the individuals and their situations and their cultures. And so when there's a circumstance he needs to deal with, he's more in that state of, okay, I know what this one is going through, or maybe I don't totally understand what this one's going through today, but maybe this is how we handle it, because he knows their story. And he may not know every detail, but he has some perspective. So I think, I don't want to just say just empathy, because that's probably an overused word, but just really taking the time to understand it. It's not about him. So he doesn't put, it's not about him. It's not about, oh, I'm going to make these people like me because I'm going to act like them. Because he doesn't do that. He doesn't try to talk like them. I mean, he did when he was younger, but he doesn't try to, take on a different dialogue or listen to a certain music or dress a certain way. He's just himself. And I think people just feel a comfort with that. They just have genuine conversation. And at some point they don't even see that he's white. I mean, we in the family don't either. We'll have conversations. I'll say something and then people, "Ooh, bless you."
Poor thing.
Yeah, it's that time of year, isn't it?
Wait, hang on. Yes, it is. So take it from what you were saying. So he doesn't, it's not just that he tries to imitate people.
He doesn't try to imitate. He's just authentically himself and understands who he's with.
Talk about how, but I don't criticize
Right.
the language and
Right. Yeah. And he doesn't, criticize other people for the way they say things or what they say. He just, just listens, but then he doesn't, ridicule them by, trying to talk like them either. He's just himself. And at some point there's just, you just forget who he is. And there are times when we're with family and we'll have conversation and I'll say, something about, a white person, some generality. And then whoever's new to the conversation will look and say, but Dave's white. It's like, Dave's not really white because he just doesn't fit that particular mold. He's just Dave. He's just genuine, authentic, and sort of like a chameleon, just kind of fits into the different situations and cultures. And that's probably the best way I can define it. So even when we were in Kuwait, I mean, they fully embraced us, and especially him, because, the men get together. The women don't go to those social gatherings, just the men. It just goes back to the old tribal days where they would gather in the tent and talk politics and family and all of that. And he would get invited to that on a regular basis. And at some point, he was not just the American anymore. He was one of them. He was their brother.
And she didn't get worried. She didn't get worried if I stayed out late with them because there was no alcohol,
Right.
and they gave me so much caffeine I wouldn't fall asleep driving home.
Right.
So I'm just so happy to hear this. There's something that happens, and I've known of very few whites that literally do transcend culture and who get accepted. There was a woman I know named Liz DiCarlo, who, if you happen to see this, Liz, know that I've been trying to find you. I haven't seen her in 20 years.
Wow.
Liz it was a white woman who went in. I hired her to do work in a Black projects, public housing, and she just moved. She just started working with the teenagers on sexual health, and she was just became part of them. And I noticed part of my family, and I kept looking at Liz at the time. This is why I'm so fascinated with Dave. I'm wondering, why was Dave so fascinating to me? I've known these whites in isolation who've had this ability,
Mm-hmm.
and I haven't understood it. And now listening to you talk, Mignon, and listening to Dave talk, there's something about a person who is comfortable enough in their own skin
Yes.
and open to others, it's sufficiently open to others that they can transcend that. It doesn't happen very often.
I agree.
Have
And
you
it's
known anyone else other than Dave who's had that capacity?
no, I think I think it's more, I mean, in high school, every now and then there was somebody that was part of the culture, but they were probably a little more showy about it. But no, I haven't met anybody that's no, there's only one Dave DeJohn.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you very much.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you, Mignon. I'm glad to talk with you. I'm looking at the time, and I want to move on to Dave's research.
Okey doke.
So that's awesome. Yeah. Sometimes Mignon, on a side note, my daughter, who I told she's Mignon's daughter, but I got her when she was 11, but she's a professor at Texas Women's, and her research area is the intersection of being African-American and being female. So she can be a little militant. She's so sweet, but sometimes they'll have conversations with each other about me when I'm in the room, and they'll say, I like when Dave's like this, not when he's, Mignon will say, yeah, I know. And I'm like, y'all, I'm here. Like, I can hear y'all talking about me. That's what that just felt like.
Okay, so Dave, your research. Here's
Yes,
the big question you're asking.
Okay.
The informal answer you've gathered, because I know when you do research, you sense you have an intuition about the answer. So
Okay.
and then any data or research you want to support what you've come up with. So let's go with first the big question.
If we know that African-American students are disproportionately disciplined, what kinds of behaviors can we learn from teachers who don't let this happen? That's, I mean, here's what's interesting to me. We as teachers are really good at differentiating instruction. We as teachers are excellent at differentiating instruction for different students. We know that this student is better at reading stuff. This one's better at pictures. And we know that. And so we would never say every student has to learn this way. And when we get a special needs student, we'll have instructions. This student can't sit in one place for 20 minutes, or this person has trouble seeing certain colors. And so we adjust that. And we'll do it intentionally, but with discipline, we won't do that. And it's like every student's going to be treated the same. And as soon as a student does something that's disrespectful or disrupts the class or whatever, we're ready to challenge that student. And in the different classes where I've taught, white students usually didn't challenge me. Hispanic students didn't challenge me. African-American students will challenge me. And so if I'm the white teacher who thinks that all students should be treated the same, I'm writing kids up left and right, which I've never done. I've never written up a kid or sent them to the assistant principal's office, but I hear that all the time, that I've written up more students this year than ever because they're having trouble dealing with the pandemic and whatever else. So the scariest thing to me is that the research is clear that if a Black student gets suspended, the chances of them going to prison skyrocket. Whereas a white student, no change. So as a teacher,
I didn't know that.
As a teacher, if I know that there's a chance, doesn't mean every student that gets suspended is going, but if I know that, it's up to me as an educator to stop that. Now, I may not have that vision. The student just told me to F off. So I'm going to put that student in their place, or I'm going to not let that happen, or whatever my thinking is. And I'm not stopping to say, this could set this kid up for failure in the future. It's my job as an educator, just like with academics, just like with special needs work, it's up to me to make sure that that student has a future. And if that means that I'm going to have to accept this kid cussing at me, or I'm going to have to accept this kid totally disrespecting me, then I've got to accept that. We'll deal with the disrespect later when the student's calm and when I'm calm, right? We'll deal with that later. Now, if it's a non-negotiable, if they hit me or hit another student or destroy equipment or whatever, okay, well, that's a different story. But when you look at the reason why most African-American students get suspended, it starts with a disrespect in the classroom or a disruption in the classroom. So it's very subjective. And it's up to us as educators, no matter what color of educator you are, to know that if I send that African-American student out, the chances of their life being ruined goes way up. So it better be about something that's serious, right? And if it's about, oh, they called you a name, well, get over it.
Whoa. Fascinating. So having heard your background, listened to Mignon describe you, I can see why you can take it. If you can be part of the community, when you're in the African American community, somebody calls you a name, that's nothing to get all. I mean, that's nothing.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I want to say this right. So one of the things that one of my committee members said was that you should not focus on the color of the teacher, because sometimes there are Black teachers that are really more harsh to Black students than white teachers are. And it wasn't until I began working where I could hear a teacher say, we have given that child so many opportunities and we've had it. They're not going to disrespect us. And the perspective that I try to share is, but that student is not being helped at home. Sometimes there's like this, well, Mr. DeJohn, let me explain to you something to you about Black students. And of course, I listen to that. I sit and listen to what they have to say, but typically it's not about that student, right? It's about, we can't let the kids do us this way and those kinds of things. So I think that if the perspective was what's going to happen, what could happen to this student if I send them off campus? Again, there are plenty of students who do things where they need to go, right? That, I mean, if they start a really big fight and there's pepper spray and all that stuff, then yeah, we need to separate them from the population. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the student who, I've looked at data from different school districts where the reason for suspension is either non-specified or disrespect or that kind of thing. You'll see the fighting column, you'll see the skipping column, but it's in the disrespect in the classroom is usually what starts, what triggers this disproportionate discipline of African American students.
Okay, I understand what you're saying. So let me see if I can say this, what I'm trying to say with this. What you're saying to me is both Black and white teachers write up kids for acting out and for disrespecting, and that it
Right.
happens with both. And I do know that to be so. Why a Black person would want to write up a kid for that is a subject that I don't want to get into now. What I'm saying is why you, as a white teacher, are able to negotiate it is because you've been negotiating cultures virtually all of your life.
Okay, that's interesting. I think maybe that's, yeah, I think that's part of it. I think the bigger part of it though is I've been working on my doctorate since 2018. And this was supposed to be a 3-year program and we're in 2022. And but the thing about this research, the thing about let me back up. The reason it's a problem with white teachers is because 90% of all public school teachers in this country are white. So if the majority of them have some kind of inherent bias and they can't handle an African American student either, making too much noise or saying something that seems disrespectful, if that teacher believes, well, I'm not prejudiced because I'm not Ku Klux Klan, or my best friend is Black, or something that they can immediately dismiss, I need to do something different for this student. And to me, the reason I'm telling you right now, I've had students that have just really said some harsh things to me, and because they're upset, and I don't want you to think I'm the calmest person in the world. I get, from my grandfather, I get that quick reaction and I can be quick to anger. And so sometimes, yeah, I'll get upset at a student or I'll get upset at a group of students, especially if they're not making progress, because I know that my students are more creative than any other students I've worked with. I know that my students have the ability to go to the top. And if they're playing around and they're not working and they're not getting their video done and those kinds of things, I get upset. And if they react to me, one day a student, one of the reasons I even came back to teaching is the summer that I was considering this was when George Floyd was murdered. And George Floyd was a student at Yates High School. That was way after I was, but I was coming into a school during the summer when the students had been out. And the first time they were coming back to school was after he had been murdered. And here I am, this new white teacher thinking, how are we going to talk about this? And so my students embraced making videos and talking about social issues and those kinds of things. But one day I got really upset at my students and I said, and I raised my voice and I said, okay, if you're not finished with your video, you better be working, whatever. And right when it got quiet, a student shouted out, George Floyd, right? And I remember being so crushed that they would even, wow, you're saying that I'm equated to the officer that killed him because I told y'all to be quiet? But instead of me taking that bait, I just said, just get your videos done. And I went back up to the front and I calmed down. But how easy would it be for me to just start, I'm going to one up you, I'm going to one up you. No one's going to win, but who's going to be hurt, right? It's not going to be me. I mean, yeah, maybe I'll be hurt for a minute, but then I'll come home and chill out. But if I send that student out of the room, there's a chance that that student's not not going to be the same.
Well-
And until people recognize until educators can see this as important as a student with special needs a break, students that have ADHD, whatever, they need a break. Our African American students need a break too. And one thing I'd like to add, you kind of changed my life in a lot of ways, Dr. Letting, but one of them was just a comment you made on social media about I forgot the name of the book. I think, is it the sum of all fears, or
The sum of us.
the sum of us? And the idea that if I, as a white teacher, start giving more breaks to African American students because I don't want them to go into school to prison pipeline, what are we doing for my white students? There's this idea that somehow that is a fair thing. I think so many of our educators mix up equality and equity, and they can't think that for 2 seconds that, yes, I'm going to let this student slide, because let's talk about fairness. Is it fair that historically African American students get disciplined more than white students? Historically, up to today. And there have been thousands of programs that have been implemented, and there's still no change. And what's interesting is all these diversity programs that get implemented to reduce African American suspensions benefit white people. I know that doesn't surprise you. It doesn't surprise you. And the Black people still stay in the same situation. And nobody seems to know how to solve this. And I'm not saying I have all the answers. I just know that yes, maybe my background makes me more empathetic, and the fact that I have 7 African American children and now 8 and soon to be 9 African American grandchildren, that I can look at things differently. But I don't want anyone to think that I'm this calm, yeah, I can handle this, it's not a problem, because it's tough to not want to send a student out of the classroom. It's tough to not do that. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned is I also read that saving face is an important thing, especially in the African American student mindset. So when a student starts getting a little out of control, I'm known to take my students out in the hallway. And in a lot of cases, I'll say, now look, it's all good, you're good. Just, you can't be slapping some guy on the arm, because it's going to go back and forth and suddenly y'all are going to be fighting. So when we go back in there, it's all cool. We're just going to go, but it's whatever. And then we go inside. Now they're never happy when I say, come out in the hallway. Oh man, Mr. Dijon. But I've never had a student disrespect me in the hallway, ever. Once I get them out there, they'll disrespect me in the classroom, but not in the hallway. So now, is that an extra step? Do I feel like I can control my classroom if I'm out in the hallway? Well, that's a risk I'm willing to take.
So here's what I know about the research, and I read somewhere, and I cannot find that article to save me. They compared what's regarded as aggression in the white culture, Latinx culture, and the Black culture. This is an old article. Now, all of y'all who are screaming that Dave and I are generalizing, we're not talking about your cousin John. We're not talking about your neighbor down the street. We're talking about statistical trends. So when I say white culture, I'm not talking about every white person on the earth. I'm talking about a dominant white culture that there's a statistical norm about. So I had to do that disclaimer. Okay, that the white culture, in terms of what's regarded as aggressive, the Black culture takes lesser insults to be perceived as aggressive. Whereas it's, in other words, it's easy to trigger aggression, to be viewed as aggressive in a white culture than it is in a Latina culture, than it is in a white culture, which means that we would get triggered faster, and we would regard an insult as faster. And I'm saying that in response to what you said about saving face. So what in a white culture would be an insult, in a Black culture would be calling, equivalent to calling somebody, talking about somebody's mama. So we take offense faster. That's what I remember reading.
Well, usually it happens when there is a correction,
Okay.
a correction,
Yes. Okay.
you can't be doing
That
that or
makes sense.
whatever.
Yes.
And and sometimes it's how I say it. I mean, in one of my classes, I got 32 students and with 24 chairs. I mean, we got other chairs, but there's 24 workstations and 32 students. And so sometimes, especially when students are doing something like editing and one student is messing with the other one, I may say something that comes across as offensive. And it's not, it's going to escalate. And de-escalation in those situations is so key. And I believe, had I not gone through this program at University of Houston, I don't know that I would even be thinking that way.
Okay. So your research then is about basically recognizing that you can ruin a kid's life by a common disciplinary procedure.
Right. And there are teachers out there that avoid that.
So that's one. And two, you want teachers to learn the skill of de-escalation.
Well, I don't know that I do mention that. It's really more about if you're using culturally relevant pedagogy to do things like teaching kids in teams, having those really unique relationships, recognizing that cultural hegemony, making sure that this is about them. Those kinds of things will cause a student, or one of my favorite ones, by the way, is challenging school norms. So if a student is getting in trouble in another class or something like that, okay, I know our policy says this, but here's the deal with this student. Having that mindset, let me just explain communal learning from my perspective. So I've always taught students to work in crews of, director, producer, because very rarely is someone going to be a one-person show when it comes to filmmaking. But here it's even more important because I'm telling you, the African-American students, in my experience, police each other more so than other races did. And I've even seen one student who just wouldn't get focused. Football player, short young lady, grabs him by the hair and says, "You are going to sit down and get this edit going like Mr. Dijon said." Now, I had to go to her and say, "You can't put your hands on other people." But guess what? He did exactly what she told her to do. I mean, he got humble and he sat down and started working. I told Mignon and said, he probably has ladies in his family who do that. And she probably has ladies in her family who do that.
Yeah.
So now that's not the most common thing is if I say, okay, by the way, teachers will tell you this is the worst invention for education, right? If you say nobody's allowed the cell phone, I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, cell phone. Okay.
If you say you ban it completely, they're going to find a way, and the families support kids having cell phones in the classroom.
Right.
The families support any family at Yates. I've never heard anyone say, yeah, they can't be on their cell phone. They want them to have their cell phone. So my solution is we'll have cell phone breaks throughout class. But if you get on your phone outside of that, I'm going to stop cell phone breaks. So let's say the cell phone period is over. It never fails. A kid was socializing during cell phone break. Now that the break is over, now I need to check my phone. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to cancel this. And you'll see some of my toughest students tell everyone, put your phone down. So the communal learning, they gain this responsibility.
So
yeah, they gain this responsibility and they hold each other accountable. And I don't have to discipline them as much, right? And if I do, I can very easily, I've had students that have threatened other students who disrespected me. And I'll say, you can't be doing that. One story, I just want to share this with you. I had a student, you may have seen this on social media, really tall. He's a defensive lineman, and he's 16 years old. He's 6'5", maybe 230 pounds, and he's really fast. And so all these colleges are looking at him. And so he's kind of checked out of high school for the most part. But he had problems with his cell phone. And I'm like, come over here. And I said, and I'm looking up at him, give me your cell phone, knowing that this kid could just crush me. And he didn't want to, but he finally gave it. And I said, I'll give it to you in the class. And in fact, when I finish talking, I'll give it to you if you'll focus. So when he left, I talked to the dean later and I said, can you find another class for him? Because he's never focused. He's on a cell phone. Maybe there's some athletic weightlifting thing he can do. And they said, okay, we'll look into it. The next day he comes in and I felt so stupid. He comes in with his jersey and says, today's homecoming and we're supposed to give our jersey to our favorite teacher. For us to wear. So I wore his shirt and I almost lost him because I was thinking about me. And maybe I'll say I was thinking about the other students because it's disrespect. And even today he'll say, hey, Mr. Dijon, when I'm in the NFL, I'm going to fly you out to my games. I'm like, bet, right?
I think that sounds like a winner.
Exactly. But, my assumption was he doesn't want to be here. He's disrespectful, whatever else. And now, what I was going to tell you about him is one day a student was disrespecting me. And I told the student to sit, there's like a little table in the hallway. I said, sit. It was when the students were coming into class. And I said, have a seat over there. And the student was mad at me, but he sat down. And so this football player I'm talking about came up and the kid said something negative to me. And he turned to that student and said, this is my favorite teacher. I'm going to knock you out. You say one more thing about him. And I'm like, okay, I got this. Thank you. Just go ahead and go inside. And he said, I'm telling you right now. And he was calling him names and everything else, threatening him. And the guy got scared, right? So when it was over, the student came over and I said, okay, we're done. Just chill out and going back in class. So I'm trying to do this thing where I'm trying to tell the student, you can't be doing that. Well, then one of the African-American ladies, the hall monitor, comes in and she grabs the student and says, way to take up for Mr. Dijon. I'm going, no, I'm trying to stop this. But it's amazing how when students feel like they belong in that classroom and they feel like they're doing something that's significant, there's no need to discipline them. And that's what I'm hoping my research is going. If it's true that teachers that are good with African-American students use these techniques, the communal learning, the avoiding cultural hegemony, that perpetual self-reflection and positive relationships. If that's what's going on, then maybe that's the answer.
Okay, so your research is that there is a way to create a cultural atmosphere, a climate in your classroom where kids can learn, be accountable to each other, hold each other accountable, and do the right thing, interspersed with periods of what appears to be disrespect or what appears to be not paying attention or what appears to be not doing the work. But those are like, it's almost like I'm picturing this climate with these waves of disruption passing through that don't have to mess with the climate. It doesn't have to stop anything.
It doesn't. But where I'm still a little puzzled, where I'm kind of excited about, data collection coming up is, so in my classroom, all the students are African-American. And so, but what happens if I'm a teacher where 5 of my students are African-American or 2 of them are, and that disrespect starts happening? Well, ideally, again, if my belief that there's a book that was recently written that I was telling you about the other day called The Formula, written by Dr. Oh, you got it? So Dr. Campbell Roan. And I told her I was going to be talking with you. And I said, I'm going to mention your book if I can. But what sort of changed my perspective, not changed my perspective, but here was a lady that went into a school in one of the FBI's 10 worst neighborhoods in the country. A school that there had been many attempts to turn it around. And she had already successfully turned a troubled school around. And now she's taking a demotion, so to speak, and come in to turn the school around. And she did it. She did it within a year. And in one part of her book, she talks about our kids are different, but they're lovable and they need love. They need encouragement. And so here's someone that believes, I believe that because she believed in the students and she believed in her staff, that school turned it around. So it's so easy for a teacher who's disrespected to stop believing in that student. But if that student is upset, there's that old saying, the students that need the most love are really seem to be unlovable, right? The ones that really need that from us.
So true. That's very true.
But what I'm asking teachers who teach African American students to do is recognize, I sound like a broken record, I'm sorry, but recognize that it's your responsibility to make sure that African American student never goes to the office. That's your goal. It's impossible to guarantee that, because they may do something that's against the law or unforgivable or something like that. But if I know that none of my African American students are going to get punished, I know I'm going to take heat from people who say, well, what are you doing for the white students? Or whatever. Yeah.
Just 1 minute on the difference, and we're close, we're almost over time. The difference between equity and equality. You mentioned that, but define that.
So equality means everyone gets the same. Everyone's treated the same. Equity means I'm going to look to see where a certain group or certain students are not getting what everyone else is getting, and I'm going to do a little extra to bring them to the level to where everyone is equal. So it means that one group may get some advantage. I mean, it's sort of like, I remember when I was a kid, there was a student, this is back in the day when the students who had special needs were in a portable somewhere else away from the main population. But I remember there was one student, he seemed slower than the rest of us. And we were doing an assignment, and the student picked we were in 5th grade. He picked a book from 1st grade. And all of us were upset, saying, why does he get to do that? We were all angry. And the teacher basically said, shut up, or you're going to go get paddled. That's what they did back in the day. But looking back at that, I mean, that made sense. Now, the teacher probably could have explained it better. But if I need to make this student successful by starting with a 1st grade book and getting them up there, that's not going to be fair to the other students, but it is fair because the situation he's in isn't fair. And the situation that African American students are in, that they're going to go, that they could go to prison if I send this student out to get disciplined, or if they get pulled over, there's a better chance they're going to get killed than if they're white motors. That's not fair. So how do we fix that? We have to do it in ways that may seem unequal, but that's the way it's got to be looked at.
Okay, so Dave, this has been insightful. It's what I had hoped for. You've said what I wanted you to say, and explained yourself, your whole thing about your sobering message that if a kid gets sent to the principal's office or sent out of the classroom, their chances of eventually going to jail skyrockets. That's a mind-blowing stat. So I'm just appreciative of who you are. Please say thanks to your lovely wife, to Min Young.
I'm a pretty lucky guy. Yeah. I'm the luckiest guy in the world.
Intelligent, whatever. I mean, I could go on with the adjectives, wife. And I thank you for being here.
Thank you. Just remember that Mignon, when she married me, her name became Mignon Yvonne Dijon, so it was supposed to happen.
Okay.
She's shaking her head at me right now.
I wish I could be a fly on the wall and inside one of Dave's classes to see how he does what he does. I have 3 major takeaways. First, I am so impressed with how Dave adapts to cultures. He grew up in a white culture, adapted to a Black culture, Hispanic culture, Kuwait culture. I spent a lot of time on this aspect in our conversation in hopes of teasing out what it is that he does that makes all that flexibility possible. How is it and what does he do that he gains acceptance everywhere he goes? I hope you looking and listening to him, you can gain a sense of how it is that people experience him as authentically himself, no matter what culture he is. What stood out for me is how he offers that genuine acceptance and asks people for their story and then truly listens to it. My second takeaway is that his experience in the classroom in which he is taught, Black kids respond to teachers' anger harshly, different from how white and Latina kids respond. My second takeaway is that in his experience in the public schools in which he is taught, Black kids respond to anger and harshness differently from how white kids and Latina kids respond. When Black kids feel offended, they're more likely to react with what Dave calls disrespectful behavior. And this leads to my third takeaway. Treating everyone equally can produce not only unequal outcomes, but disastrous outcomes. Here's what Dave says about this. The research is clear that if a Black student gets suspended, the chances of that kid going to prison skyrockets, whereas a white student, no change. In a nutshell, he's describing the school to prison pipeline. Because of this, he suggests teachers rethink their approach to discipline, just as they take into consideration learning difficulties and how they handle students. In a learning situation, if a student can't sit still for more than 20 minutes, teachers will intentionally make accommodations. In the same way, he suggests teachers rethink how they approach discipline. This is contrary to the zero tolerance policy that even a minor infraction gets you sent to the principal. As he says, unlike white or Latina kids, African American children will challenge him. So teachers who believe that all students should be treated equally may end up writing up and punishing Black kids disproportionately. He's advocating for teachers to stop and think. If I write up this kid or send him to the principal, I may end up ruining this kid's life for life. So as a teacher, I have to learn to deal with the kid's misbehavior in a different way. Over and over again in settings, I have found that treating everyone equally may disadvantage those who do not fit neatly into our system of what equality should look like. That's it. I hope you found this discussion provocative and useful. I certainly did. Thanks for listening. And if you want to keep learning with us, please subscribe to our blog and check out Pathfinders, our membership program, where we dive deep in these blog posts and explore them together.